Good evening. There are words in military affairs that always sound not just like a technical term, but like a kind of magic spell, promising absolute, unbreakable security. These words, which those who sell us their doctrines and their systems love to throw around, are impenetrability, invulnerability, and most cynically, unhackability. It is this word unhackable that for decades has been a kind of trademark, a billboard for an entire security architecture that the Russian Federation inherited from the Soviet Union and which it believed it had successfully modernized. We are talking about the famous myth-shrouded but now seemingly pierced through radar wall. Its essence was simple, yet grandiose in its conception: to build a continuous, multi-layered system of radar control along the entire extended front, which Moscow always called the Western direction. This system, thanks to redundancy, classified algorithms, and colossal transmitter power, was intended to become, in the literal sense, a wall through which no stealth aircraft, no cruise missile could slip. A system that could not be blinded or disabled by a single pinpoint attack, since it essentially represents a unified, centralized, self-healing organism. And you know what the most interesting thing is? In the history of wars and conflicts, there is essentially no more reliable indicator of impending failure than precisely this boastful statement, impenetrable. You only have to hear someone invest billions of dollars in what they call the Maginot Line, the Siegfried Line, or say an invulnerable radar. And you can be sure the world has already found a way to bypass that line or system, but those who built it do not know it yet. They built a fortress, while the war, meanwhile, moved into another dimension. That is where we are tonight. Recent reports from the combat zone, which, it must be said, the Kremlin tries to ignore and sometimes even ridicule, show us not just the pinpoint destruction of some other expensive piece of ironmongery. No, we are talking about something much deeper and doctrinal. We are talking about Ukraine, using, as we can now assume, a combination of long-range and high-precision means, striking the key, indispensable elements of this centralized radar network. And most importantly, this strike, this attack, was not just noise on the airwaves, it was a lights-out moment. The reports that seep through even the dense curtain of military censorship all point to one thing: entire segments of airspace, previously reliably controlled by this wall, suddenly and dramatically plunged into darkness for Russian air defense operators. Not for 5 minutes, not for 10, which could be attributed to a power switch or a brief glitch. No, for hours. Think about that. For a country whose military doctrine is based on complete, total control over its airspace, for a country that believes it has nothing to fear as long as its eyes see everything and everywhere, a multi-hour blinding of its integrated air defense system in key areas is not just a tactical blunder. It is, in essence, a doctrinal collapse. Because the issue is not the cost of the destroyed radar. The issue is that during this critically important period, during these hours of darkness, the airspace that the Kremlin considered its own by right, which it guaranteed as closed to the enemy, suddenly became absolutely open for deep, decisive strikes. And this opens up, as we will see, a whole fan of strategic opportunities for the enemy. Analysts we spoke with today call this nothing less than the strategic boomerang. A boomerang launched decades ago when the bet was placed on gigantic, centralized, stationary, irreplaceable complexes. Because when you make something irreplaceable, you make it a priority target for the enemy, you give them the key to the destruction of the entire system, and that is exactly what seems to have happened. So, today we are not talking about an explosion, we are talking about a strategic shift. A shift that forever changes the calculus of what is possible in this war. And that is exactly where we are tonight. And here, perhaps, we need to pause. Think about that for a second. What exactly does this failure mean? This lights-out moment on the airwaves? This is not just an incident. It is not just a technical glitch that can be fixed by replacing a fuse or pressing a restart button. To understand the full depth of the strategic damage, we need to take a step back. We need to understand what this radar wall that we are talking about is in the context of Russian and formerly Soviet military doctrine. To understand this, we need to go back not to 2022 and not even to 2014. We must go back to the Cold War era. The Soviet Union, faced with the superior power of American strategic bombers and cruise missiles, developed a truly monumental, gigantic, redundant air defense system. It was not just a scattering of disparate batteries, it was a unified, integrated, strictly hierarchical organism. Its philosophy was totality. If one radar went down, its sector was immediately picked up by two neighboring ones. And the central element of this system, its eyes, its main brain, was always represented by these, how should I put it, royal radars, huge, powerful, stationary complexes that, by design, were supposed to see everything and see always. And this is where the greatest contradiction lies, the very conflict of narratives that we are talking about today. The Kremlin spent decades, and especially in recent years, selling this Soviet technological fetish as something modernized, as something advanced, as an impregnable fortress. Russian military experts, Russian television, they all chanted in unison, "Our air defense system, our radar wall is the guarantee that no drone, no missile, no stealth aircraft can slip through." They elevated this system to the rank of not just a military tool, but a symbol of national sovereignty and technological superiority. And most importantly, they laid down the principle at its core: we see them, but they cannot see us. But their actions, as you rightly pointed out, scream otherwise. They scream that this monumentality turned into inflexibility. They scream that this centralization, which was conceived as a strength, is in fact the main catastrophic vulnerability. This is where we encounter the concept of the strategic boomerang. What is a boomerang in military affairs? It's when your main bet, your most expensive and advertised asset, returns and hits you on the head with devastating force. Russia bet on irreplaceability. They built a system where individual key elements, these central radars, became too large, too stationary, too complex for quick replacement, and consequently, too valuable. When you declare something irreplaceable, you give the enemy not just a target, you give them a key. The key to paralyzing the entire system by simply knocking out that very single, irreplaceable core. That is exactly what happened, judging by incoming reports. The attack was not aimed at the periphery, not at ordinary mobile complexes. No, the strike was aimed at the heart, at those eyes, without which this entire wall turns into a blind, deaf, and helpless pile of expensive metal. And when those eyes closed for hours, not minutes, but hours, not just a hole appeared, a window of strategic opportunity emerged. It was during this critical multi-hour period when Russian air defense operators saw only a black screen, where a minute ago there was a detailed picture of the airspace, that Ukraine was able to carry out its deepest and boldest actions. We are talking about this blacked out sector becoming a corridor used for strikes on targets that, according to all the Kremlin's calculations, were previously absolutely unattainable. This is not just a loss of equipment, it is a loss of information sovereignty over their own airspace. This is what authoritarian regimes fear most. Their power rests on the illusion of total control. And when that control publicly and dramatically crumbles, it's no longer just tactics. It is the beginning of a structural, doctrinal collapse. And that is exactly where we are tonight. This is not just an incident. It is not just a loss of equipment. It is, in essence, an irreversible shift that forever changes the calculus of what is possible in this war. This is what we must talk about when we look at these hours of darkness in Russian airspace. This is not just a tactical success for Ukraine. It is, as analysts say, the destruction of the operating environment. When you knock out the central element from a highly integrated system, and the Soviet and Russian air defense is precisely such a system, you don't just create a hole, you create irreversible dysfunction. You break the philosophy of its operation. Russian air defense doctrine is based on the idea that information flows from top to bottom and horizontally, in real time, that every radar is an eye, and the system is a single brain. But when this central royal radar, which we discussed in the previous part, suddenly falls silent for hours, this entire complex hierarchical structure begins to suffocate. Neighboring, less powerful radars, of course, may try to pick up the sector, but they are not capable of providing the same depth and quality of information, that very totality of control. They cannot replace the one that was designed as irreplaceable. It's like removing the main processor from a computer. You can connect other devices, but they won't be able to run the entire operating system. It is this that changes the entire calculus. This changes the calculus. For Ukraine, the window of strategic opportunity turns from an instant chance into a prolonged, exploitable corridor. Now Ukraine can plan its deepest and boldest strikes on targets that were previously absolutely inaccessible, knowing that in this sector they have guaranteed hours of impunity. This allows them not just to inflict damage, but to dictate terms, forcing Moscow to redeploy mobile, less effective complexes to plug the hole, thereby weakening defenses in other equally important areas. This is a public, undeniable humiliation. Their power rests on the illusion of total control, on the myth of technological superiority. And when this control publicly, dramatically, and most importantly, long-term crumbles, it is not just a loss of equipment. It is a blow to the symbol of national sovereignty that they themselves erected. In an authoritarian regime, propaganda will, of course, try to ridicule or ignore this fact, but the real operators on the ground, those who see this black screen, they know the truth. And that truth is the beginning of the structural collapse of their doctrine. For NATO and the West, this is an invaluable lesson. This incident provides the whole world with factual proof that the monumentality and centralization on which Soviet military thought rested are its Achilles heel. It is now known that the entire system can be paralyzed by one precise strike aimed at its most lauded, most irreplaceable link. This knowledge, this vulnerability, will not disappear when the radar is replaced. It is hardwired into the DNA of this doctrine. This is the irreversibility of this event. Even if Russia manages to build or deploy a new, identical radar there in the coming months, it will not be able to regain the illusion of invulnerability. It will not be able to restore faith in a system that was publicly, dramatically, and for hours knocked off the airwaves. The enemy, and we are talking about Ukraine, has proven that it holds the key to the master switch. And that knowledge, like rust, eats away at the confidence throughout the chain of command. This is the end of the era of impenetrable walls and gigantic stationary fortresses. War, as we have already said, has moved into another dimension where victory goes not to the one who built the biggest tower, but to the one who can find the smallest. Most critical point of failure in the enemy's system. We have seen how a system created during the Cold War to combat massive strategic bombers turned out to be completely unprepared for a pinpoint, surgically precise attack in the 21st century. It was created to see everything and always, but now we know that it can plunge into darkness for hours. And that is exactly where we are tonight. Good night and good luck.